The Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture. I welcome you to this panel on integral human dignity. My name is Fidelis Olokumboro. I'll be moderating to this panel, and we have three distinguished gentlemen who will be helping us to lead today's conversation and discussion. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start, just to let you know that this event is being recorded, and we presume that we have your permission to be part of this event. So, thank you. Each of the three panelists will have 20 minutes each, but let me run you through each of them to introduce each of them to you in their order of presentation. First, we'll be having discussion and conversation from Joseph Rice. Joseph Rice will be speaking on the title of his presentation will be From Human Currents to Human Creator, the Dignity Formula of John 13 at the Foundation of a Post-Pandemic Economy. The summary of the conversation will be Rice will be talking to us on the dignity formula of John 13:3, which situates human relation to God, their origin and end, and also how human person enjoy a non-exchangeable value, first land in the family. Joseph Rice is an associate professor of philosophical theology at Seton Hall University. He earned his PhD from the Catholic University of America and holds degrees from the Pontifical Ateneo Regina Apostolorum in Rome and the University of Notre Dame. Prior to earning his doctorate, he was assistant to the president of Anejo University, Mexico City, a classically trained specialist in the philosophical thought of John Paul II. Dr. Rice's primary interest lied in investigating questions of intersubjectivity, conditions for authentic participation in community, the ethics of marriage and family, and the experience of conscience as related to self-constitution. Professor Rice, welcome. He's the one sitting right there at the middle.
Thank you. Do you prefer we present here? Or?
You can choose here. Your choice.
Does anyone have a preference? So it's easier to see up here, right? Okay. I'm going to partially read this presentation and partially talk about it so that I can keep it flowing and also finish under the 20 minutes, which I think now is probably about probably a few minutes less. So the idea behind this presentation is that in the pandemic, we've seen a kind of exacerbating effect leading to a concern that market forces that widen a gap between rich and poor impede human flourishing. Even when markets appear to do well, they may not actually do good. That's the idea. And so the ideal of a sustainable, inclusive economy promises to add value back through economic activity rather than extracting it to enrich a few at the expense of the many. In light of this, we have a number of proposals, probably the most famous being the Great Reset, to impose a systematic, integrated global social reality to prioritize humanity over profit. But that one's notion of humanity is relevant to that kind of a rethinking. And theories that resolve inequality while conceiving of persons or families as functional elements of a social whole may not account fully for the anthropological or ethical implications of their own models. What I'm going to do here is to present a notion of humanity and human dignity from the thought of Karol Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II. And from that, I'm going to engage two kinds of economic theories exemplified in the work of Frank Knight on the one hand, and Thomas Piketty, Mariana Mazzucato, and Donnie Roderick. And the contrast there is the Knight speaks of the family as the fundamental unit of the social whole, and the other three tend to emphasize a balance between subsidiarity and solidarity that tilts a little bit more toward the whole. Now, one of the things we have to keep in mind here is that economic and social models are typically based on assumptions. And if you change the assumptions, you can change what the model will tell you to do, right? And so what I'd like to do here is look at the anthropological assumptions that should be informing our economic thinking, our social thinking. And then briefly at the end, ask how we might think about integrating those assumptions into such proposals. Karl Wojtyła is best understood in light of his formative experiences under two totalitarian systems. Totalitarian systems isolate their subjects from their natural origins and ends so that each becomes an interchangeable part of the societal whole. In other words, reduce persons to parts of a whole. Persons then become rootless and superfluous. They have no meaning apart from the whole. Wojtyła's response there is to appeal to the origins and ends of the human person. And I think in doing so, he's reflecting what I like to call a dignity formula in John 13:3. Aware that he had come from God and was returning to God, Jesus got up, dressed as a slave, and proceeded to wash the feet of his disciples. It's that awareness that one is coming from God and returning to God that I think we can call a dignity formula. Through this action, Jesus affirms his divine and human worth. And similarly for John Paul II, our awareness of God as our natural origin and end is the foundation of our human dignity. We are worth the love of God. This is the foundation of our human munus, or task to love God and to love each other, because we're loving those whom God loves, building a community. Now, at this point, one of the things that I would develop, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because I want to move this along here, is the notion of communio that Wojtyła takes from the Second Vatican Council and actually contributes to it. I just want to emphasize a couple of things with respect to it here. This is a notion that we find principally in Gaudium et Spes, and one of the key passages in Gaudium et Spes is Gaudium et Spes 24, according to which man is the only creature on earth that God willed for himself, cannot find himself except through a sincere gift of self. And Wojtyła says that causes, or that allows us to conclude that God has inscribed into each one of us a law of the gift. It's kind of like a natural law to give ourselves away. And he does this in the context of John of the Cross. John of the Cross is a Salamancan Thomist with Augustinian roots. And John of the Cross proposes a path of communion, participation, and transformation. The transformation is the transformation of mutual self-gift. Now, Wojtyła finds in humanity, which for him in Polish is actually different from the word we use in English. In English, humanity can mean something concrete, an individual human being, et cetera, individual human nature. It can also mean something abstract, and so there's always ambiguity, but in Polish those are two different terms. Wojtyła was using the concrete term to refer to the human nature of an individual that orients that person to act. And he identifies there two potentials, a metaphysical potential to realize the actions that go into the gift of self, and the axiological reference to the dignity of the human person. We're loved into existence by God. God knows everything he's ever going to make. And God exists out of time, so that's already incorrect, right? But God, in his eternal present, knows all things, including those things that will never exist. And Thomas says the difference between things that will never exist and things that will is that God also wills them or loves them. Thomas doesn't use the word love, but I think we can. And so we are loved into existence. We are good because we are loved by God. God doesn't love us because we're good. And we then become good, as Thomas would say, simpliciter, by loving God back, right? And the whole of this transformation of the lover into the beloved it can be seen in this circle of loving. Now, Wojtyła develops a theory of participation and alienation that expresses a dynamism of human action that enables us to act together with others in a way that we see them as persons, and we see that in them the same potential for them to act in that way with us. The opposite of this, what Wojtyła calls alienation, comes in two forms: individualism and anti-individualism, or objective totalism. And the participation leads to a recognition of the mutual good of oneself and of the other. The denial of participation leads to some sort of an imbalance there, where we subordinate one to the other. Individualism denies participation's first meaning, on which the second depends, valuing the good of the individual over the common good. Totalism does the reverse. Okay. What happens, though, in totalism especially, is that the common good becomes exchanged for that of the state. And here again, I'm going to summarize a little what I have here. What happens then is that persons exist for the state instead of for God and each other. Adolf Hitler actually admired that. He thought that was a feature. And he called for the subordination of the interest of the ego to the conservation of the community. That's a line from Mein Kampf, if you can get through it. And what happens is that kind of a subordination, that kind of an imbalance, where we see the good of the individual, the good of the state, but we don't balance them according to the common good, falsifies the conscience, where in conscience we experience human action according to God as our origin and end. When ideology then substitutes for the form of the social whole, the followers of such an ideology are relieved from the responsibility to seek the truth about the common good. Such a society becomes dehumanized. It loses its sense of solidarity. It may fall completely under the control of social forces that invoke the form of solidarity to suppress the authentic solidarity that would be natural to the community. In this context, Wojtyła describes two dimensions, two anthropological dimensions in humans. The first he calls the exchangeable man, the second, the non-exchangeable man. If I can briefly summarize these, the exchangeable man is the perception that we ourselves are exchangeable for something else. We look at our talents, what can I get for those, right? We look at the things we produce, we exchange our labor, et cetera. That's good, right? Economies are based on that. But there's a deeper level called the non-exchangeable man, which is the experience of conscience, where the value of a human being cannot be reduced to exchange, because the value of a human being is that you are loved by God. And if you're loved by God, then you are worth the love of God, which is infinite. You're not worth anything less than that. Right? And so somehow when we model economic theories at the exchangeable level, we're not going to be able to include the theological, ethical, non-exchangeable aspect in there, but we do have to make sure we're not violating it, right? And that's going to be a little bit of the tension that we're looking for here. The danger here is that we come to look at human beings in some form of, or some lens of quantity, and then we no longer see the person in relation to God. Now, I should also note that this is not just about socialism or the problem of an overarching state. The exchangeable man when we look at ourselves as exchangeable, we can also become fascinated with possessing and consuming things as a way of increasing our own perception of our objective value. We can fall into what Francis describes as a throwaway culture. In this way, consumerism as well can lead to a denial of the dignity formula comparable to that of totalitarianism. The inner effect is the same. The non-exchangeable man dwells in the inner life, what Augustine called the inner man, which Wojtyła identifies with conscience. The exchangeable man dwells in the outer life. His attention is fixed on the changing and impermanent, so that he becomes alienated from transcendence, incapable of participation, and reduced to an interchangeable part of a material or cultural whole. How much time do I have? Okay. Once we begin to define our worth by material standards, we can come to equate our dignity with things we desire or possess, and we can think of this equation as a condition of freedom. We exchange our labor or other human activity for finite rewards, and we can begin to live according to a paradigm of obligation and debt instead of love and gift. Now, the next section is something I'll summarize here because Wojtyła was quite famous for it, which is that in marriage and family he speaks of a school of participation where we learn to live according to love and gift. And to go into that, you could go into that in great detail. I just want to emphasize one thing, which is that Wojtyła defines the person in two ways that I think are relevant here. One is he actually says the person is, in fact, conscience. Now, he says that in a retreat, so he's not being technical, but he's being metaphorical. But in one of his philosophical writings, he says that the person is a subject of morality, not a moral subject. Big difference. Subject of morality. Okay? Subjectivity is existential. Morality flows from it. And in Wojtyła's view, we are subjects of morality who happen to engage in economic activity, not subjects of economy who happen to engage in actions of social, cultural, or moral significance. To define the person only economically can lead to the reduction of the person to a commodity. This is the exchangeable man. In the family, we speak of a primordial subjectivity of the family itself, in which people learn that they have been loved into existence by God and that they're welcomed into a loving family. Now, families don't always do this, but we're talking again about the natural idea of what a family should be. John Paul there says that it's in the family that we learn participation. It's in the family that we learn the value of the human being, the dignity formula. One other aspect to touch on here is the aspect of a contrast that I would like to draw between homo curans and homo curator, or curators, it's often said today, as these are terms that are used in the ecological context and other contexts. Homo curans is an interesting term. Etymologically comes from cura, actually comes from an anthropogonic myth about the origins of humans being earthly and divine, right? And Cicero was the first one to combine se with cura and speak of securitas, security, meaning freedom from anxiety. And homo curans is the one who is kind of anxious, like Martha, about the way things are going. But to graduate, to get to the point of being homo curator, where you can take responsibility for someone else, it's necessary to assimilate the dignity formula, where one can say, I have been loved into existence. I am therefore able to give myself to you because I know in doing so I'm not losing myself, right? And so the anxiety is no longer part of the relation of care. It becomes more of something positive that is described by Wojtyła in his poetry as a radiation of fatherhood. At this point, the last part of the paper, I take these ideas into the question of contemporary responses to the pandemic. I'm going to summarize this as well. I've chosen two orientations of these responses. One is the response of those who emphasize the social whole, the other the response of those who emphasize the subsidiarity as a response. I have about 2 minutes. Good. Okay. If we apply the dignity formula, the progress we should be looking for should not be so much quantitative as personalistic. How does a policy enable us to flourish as humans? Economic models that quantify just outcomes may have unintended consequences to the detriment of persons. A just economy fosters the thriving of a human community, not just some members of it. But such thriving is reducible neither to a material outcome nor to a relative standard of equality. Inequality or inequity may increase even as material standards rise for all. Nevertheless, they still can contribute to a weakening of the social fabric. As inclusive economic models aim to affirm human dignity, their success depends on an accurate understanding of it. Following the dignity formula, human dignity is measured by the love of God. And human justice is therefore vertical before it's horizontal. Justice to the Creator is the condition of all human justice. If we think about justice horizontally as numerical equality, sameness, or even fairness, we can mask the relation to God that guarantees human dignity. Rather than being worth God, a human could then be worth whatever he or she produces or contributes relative to others. So a truly inclusive economy is going to be one that affirms the value of a human in relation to God. Again, we're not telling the economic theorists to start doing theology, but just not to violate the principle, right? Thomas Piketty is probably the most famous exponent of this kind of a theory. He argues that market economies are inherently unstable. There's systemic inequality, systemic inequity. He doesn't emphasize quantity so much as he emphasizes quantity, but also in a historical and cultural context, but he also leaves the dignity formula out. Mariana Mazzucato proposes we can achieve a just economy by a partnership, entrepreneurial partnership between government and other sectors, the public sector, where the government actually becomes an actor in the public sector. But again, in doing so, the person becomes functional in the system. The worth of a person is how the person is seen in the system. Donnie Roderick, I like Donnie Roderick a little better here, observes that we have to be a little more realistic about the way that these models go, et cetera. But he does also argue that the solutions we're looking for come at the level of the social whole. So to conclude here, how do we assess such theories? In doing so, I'll briefly refer to the theories of Frank Knight. Frank Knight, for example, says that we have to emphasize the family as the subsidiary unit. But even in Frank Knight's approach, the family is seen as a rational unit. The argument I'm making in this paper is that if we conserve the dignity formula of John 13, we can perhaps keep theories like this, but we can inform them with an understanding that the unintended consequences of their anthropological assumptions may actually be the most central and important aspects of their theories. I'm out of time, so.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Rice. Just to let you know that your comments or your questions will be taken after all of the presentations. And also to help the panelists keep to their time, I would remind you when you have just 5 more minutes to go. And they'll also let you know when your time is exhausted. So next we'll be having Professor Daniel Philpott, whose conversation and the topic will be Resurrection Justice. So in Resurrecting Justice, he will be contrasting the dominant conception of justice in the modern West and the constant will and also the justice of the Bible, a comprehensive right to relationship. Professor Phil Potter is a professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. He earned his PhD in 1996 from Harvard University and specializes in religion and global politics, focusing on religious freedom, reconciliation, the political behavior of religious actors, and Christian political theology. He has published extensively, some of which are God's Century, Resurgent Religion in Global Politics, and also Just and Unjust Peace and Ethic of Political Reconciliation. He has also promoted reconciliation as an activist in Kashmir and the Great Lakes region of Africa. Professor Phil, welcome.
Thank you very much. Much is at stake in justice. John Rawls's apothegm, "Justice is the first virtue of social institutions," could find the endorsement of history's greatest political philosophers, including Plato, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, John Locke, and John Stuart Mill. In today's constitutional liberal democracies, the dominant way of understanding justice is one that has its roots in Roman law and is developed through the medieval Enlightenment and modern liberal thought. Its classic formulation is the firm and constant will to render each person his due. In the modern world, what is due is translated into two concepts: rights and retribution. People receive their due when their right not to be tortured, defamed, or arbitrarily detained is respected, and when their right to be provided the payment that is owed them, an education, and safe working conditions is fulfilled. With respect to past wrongs, due means retribution. Criminals deserve to pay for their misdeeds. The justice that renders due involves what people are owed, entitled to, deserve, or are indebted to perform or pay. Other virtues, by contrast, though they may be admirable, do not involve what is due to anyone: mercy, generosity, friendship, hospitality, forgiveness, and living one's life as a gift. Christians may ask, though, is this concept of justice ours? I contend that the justice of due differs markedly, though not completely, from the justice that is found in the Bible, which carries an overarching meaning of comprehensive right relationship, the entirety of right conduct on the part of God and of humans. In the Bible, the justice that humans are to exercise conforms to and flows from the justice that God exercises towards humans, culminating in the cross and resurrection of Jesus Christ. My title, Resurrecting Justice, then, carries a double meaning, referring first to the endeavor of retrieving a forgotten justice, second, to the event in which this justice climaxes. Today, I wish to argue that justice in the Bible means comprehensive right relationship, to contrast it with the justice of rendering due, and to show why the contrast matters, namely that there are important payoffs for public life today. Where is justice to be found in the Bible? It is a matter of translation. Justice is, after all, an English word, not a word in the Bible's original languages. The case for the frequency and grand meaning of justice in the Bible depends on a twofold task of translation. First, we must fix the meaning of Hebrew and Greek words in the Bible that pose as candidates for justice. Second, we must establish that the English word justice properly translates them. To take the first task, among the most important words that could translate into justice are, first, the Hebrew tzedek, or its feminine variant, tzedakah, which appear 276 times in the Old Testament and always mean comprehensive right relationship. This includes the relationship that God establishes with humans and the totality of obligations that humans have towards God and one another. In the Septuagint, the 2nd century BCE translation of the Bible into Greek, the Old Testament into Greek, tzedek is translated by dikaiosune, a word that then appears in the New Testament when it is written, 92 times in fact, where it also means comprehensive right relationship. Dikaiosune is the second of the most important biblical words that can translate into justice. Now, English readers of the Bible might be surprised that these words translate into justice. In many Bibles, justice does not appear nearly as frequently as these words do in the original Hebrew and Greek scriptures. The reason for this is that justice often hides behind righteousness, the word to which translators often turn instead. Think only of the famous verse from the Gospel of Matthew, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness," sung by every Christian teenager who has sat around a bonfire at camp. A tradition exists, however, of translating as justice the words that are often rendered as righteousness. This is the tradition of Latin, the language that contains the root for the English word justice, but none for the English word righteousness, whose root is Germanic. In the Vulgate, the historically influential Latin translation of the Bible, all of the words that sometimes appear in English Bibles as righteousness appear instead as justitia, or a close variant. Bibles in Latin-based languages, such as French, Spanish, and Italian, will render the same words as justice, justitia, and justitia, while the English Douay Rheims Bible, which was translated from the Vulgate, renders virtually all of them as justice, or judgment, closely related. While there is perhaps no definitive case as to whether these terms ought to be translated into English through justice or righteousness, translating them as justice, I argue, is warranted. English contains usages of justice, in fact, that approximate the holism of comprehensive right relationship, as found, for instance, in the writings of care feminists. For instance, Elizabeth Schultz, who spoke last night, would be in this category, and I've relied upon her work for this. The Restorative Justice movement, as well as translations of Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Ethics, where justice was meant comprehensively. So there is a kind of a tradition in English of translating justice in this comprehensive way. By choosing justice to translate these terms in the Bible, we gain a biblical vision of that virtue which is widely thought to be the primary one of public life. Some other words in the Bible also plausibly translate into justice or a close cousin. Important, for instance, is the Hebrew mishpat, which best translates into judgment, and Douay Rheims translates it usually as judgment, in my view, as the judgment of God or a judge in a law court. In numerous instances in the Old Testament, mishpat appears with tzedek or tzedakah as a hendiadys, or pairing of words, that means right conduct in the social and political realm, often pertaining to a king. So I give a sample verse where that appears. We also hear in the Mass, it is right and just. That's essentially that hendiadys, pairing tzedek and mishpat. Here, my primary focus, though, is on tzedek and dikaiosune, which carry the comprehensive meaning in which I am most interested. While maintaining their general meaning, these terms, as found in the scriptures, vary along two dimensions. The first pertains to agency. Sometimes it is God who exercises justice, and sometimes it is humans who are commanded to exercise justice. The second follows a distinction that philosopher Nicholas Walterstorff has introduced, that between primary justice, this is along the top row, defining what it means to live in right relationship, and rectifying justice, defining what it means to address past wrongs. Together, the two distinctions create four dimensions of the justice of right relationship, corresponding to the many actual uses of tzedek in the Bible, which are arrayed in the table here. Understanding biblical justice begins with divine agency, the top row of the diagram, reflecting that it is God who establishes and repairs justice. Divine primary justice is depicted most vividly in the Psalms and Isaiah. God, acting out of God's just character, establishes moral order, proclaims commandments that govern human beings' relationships to one another and God, fashions human beings so that they flourish through these commandments, and attaches blessings and curses for following or failing to follow these commandments. Divine rectifying justice is God's restoration of comprehensive right relationship in response to the sin of humanity. In 2nd Isaiah, Tzedek means the saving justice through which God restores the Israelites after their exile in Babylon. In the letter to the Romans, influenced by Isaiah, Paul employs the justice of God to describe God's salvation of the world through Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. 2 Peter uses justice to describe the new heavens and new earth, where this restoration of right relationship has been completed. Human primary justice, that of the lower left-hand quadrant, is the comprehensive right relationship that God calls humans to enact. In the Old Testament, tzedek often means the entirety of the laws that God revealed in his covenants, most importantly, the laws he gave to Moses on Mount Sinai. In the New Testament, dikaiosune means Jesus' broad teachings about how to live, most importantly, the new law that he, the new Moses, proffered on the Sermon on the Mount. Human rectifying justice, that of the lower right-hand quadrant, involves God's teaching about how humans are to respond to wrongs, namely sins and crimes. In the Old Testament, this includes commandments and precepts on responding to wrongs in the community of Israel. In the New Testament, it includes the teachings of Jesus on retaliation and forgiveness, as well as those of Paul on the same issues, as well as the proper functions of temporal authority. In light of the Bible's concept of justice and its variations, we may now contrast biblical justice and the justice of rendering due. My broad claim is that biblical justice does not void what is due, but rather enfolds and exceeds it. It does not reject rights or retribution, the two key principles that modern democracies derive from due, but rather espouses a fuller notion of justice. To riff on an old hymn, there is a wideness in God's justice. Consider divine rectifying justice, the justice of God's response to sin. In part, the Bible describes this response in terms and metaphors that comport with due. In Isaiah, God's justice involves the punishment of Israel through exile, but also redemption, ransom, recompense, expiation, and demand of service from Israel, all terms that involve due. In the New Testament, numerous metaphors for Christ's saving action connote the rendering of due, acquittal, paying the debt of sin, expiation, and ransom. Yet, 2nd Isaiah also describes Israel as being renewed, restored to its land, and restored to right relationship with the community, especially through the uplifting of the poor, and does not connect this renewal to payment or to due. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, tells of God's saving activity as a gracious gift that God bestowed while we were still sinners, meaning that God did not give humanity's due. In God's strange justice, God graciously renders what is due on behalf of those who owe what is due but cannot pay it. Like the author of Isaiah, Paul insists that this saving justice actually restores persons and relationships, bestowing life, peace, grace, charity, in the presence of the Spirit. This is no mere balancing of accounts. Human justice, both primary and rectifying, also involves both rendering what is due and giving beyond what is due. It involves rights, which the Bible affirms in many places, though usually in highly particular ways, and which can also be apprehended more generally as natural rights through natural law. And here I would give dignity a very important place. The principle of retribution in human affairs, especially in context of judgment, also finds a place in both the Old and New Testaments. The Bible's human primary justice, expressed through tzedek and dikaiosune, though, also involves commands and virtues that extend beyond due, such as generosity, mercy, a wide obligation of service to the poor and the stranger, and living one's life as a gift. Human rectifying justice also involves, likewise, the forgiveness of moral debts, love for enemies, and reconciliation, or a restoration of right relationship, all of which involve giving to others in excess of what they are owed, have a right to, or had coming to them. Biblical justice, then, does not void what is due, yet exceeds what is due. It culminates in the cross and resurrection of Jesus, which brings to a climax God's saving justice, vindicate and give new authority to the justice that God calls humans to perform, and set forth the decisive pattern of human justice, namely self-giving love in conformity to and imitation of Jesus' sacrifice. Take up your cross and follow me, as all of the synoptic gospels proclaim. Human justice flows from divine justice. Embodying this justice is the sacrament of the Eucharist, which enacts God's saving justice and transforms its human participants such that they become this justice. The justice of right relationship, then, is Eucharistic justice. The justice of right relationship also relates to other virtues and concepts differently than the justice of rendering due. Tzedek and dikaiosune are overarching umbrella terms, what Thomas Aquinas calls architectonic terms, and thus enfold other terms rather than enfold other terms rather than standing in contrast to them. Take mercy, for instance, which Enlightenment thinkers thought of as clemency, or a release of a criminal or debtor from what is due. In the Bible, by contrast, mercy is a broad will to restore that is roughly equivalent to rectifying justice. Or consider peace, which the Bible renders as shalom or eirene, and is the virtual equivalent of primary justice, defined as being a state of right relationship between people, not just the mere absence of violence or friction. Now, the relationship between charity or love and justice is also important, but in the interest of time, I'm going to say that I can speak more about that if you're interested in the discussion. Ultimately, I am interested in Christian justice because I believe it contains important payoffs for public life in modern states dominated by due. The Christian is called to live and promote a justice that enfolds, quote, all things, unquote, as Paul described God's reconciliation of the world in his letter to the Colossians. All things includes political life, which is a major portion, though not, of course, the entirety, of right relationship among humans. While, much like the contemporary authors known as integralists, I advocate a political life transformed by the Christian gospel and Christian justice. Unlike at least some integralists, I envision this taking place within major features of constitutional liberal democracy, such as religious freedom and the institutional independence of church and state, features which I believe have their strongest grounding in Christianity. What would be entailed in a politics informed by the justice of right relationship? I can only briefly adumbrate 5 features. First, such a politics is fully informed by and derived from the overarching good entailed in Christian justice. It rejects the project of Enlightenment liberalism of separating the right from the good and politics from the authority of the kingdom of God. Politics may be a subset of the right relationship that God sets forth, but is envisioned as being infused by it. Second, such a politics brings to human affairs both what is due and what goes beyond due. With respect to abortion, to take an example, the justice of right relationship unequivocally affirms the right to life of every unborn person, while also invoking virtues such as care, forgiveness, and a restoration of the fabric of relationships surrounding the mother-child relationship. Third, such a politics seeks to address past wrongs through a restoration of person and relationships that is wider than, though it may include, retribution, certainly wider than retribution understood as an abstract and isolable principle. For instance, it would advocate restorative justice as an alternative to mass incarceration in the United States. And it would address social historical wounds such as racism through reconciliation processes modeled on those of countries such as South Africa that have faced the injustices of war and dictatorship in the past generation. Fourth, the justice of right relationship calls for a politics that stresses holism and the interdependence of realms of justice, much as is found in Catholic social teaching or in the whole life politics of the American Solidarity Party, for instance. Fifth, the justice of right relationship holds out a balm for the atomism and breakdown of social ties and communities common in the U.S. and other Western countries whose citizens are bowling alone. A justice that not only respects rights, but also practices generosity, hospitality, gift, friendship, mercy, and forgiveness would be a justice that elicits and repairs thick ties between citizens. These are only a few implications of the biblical justice of right relationship for modern politics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Philpott. The next presentation is titled, What is Human Dignity? Distinguishing between True and False Dignity. The conversation, the narrative of that presentation will be how the true dignity corresponds to the intrinsic worth found in human within Christian anthropology, and how false dignity includes the concept of false freedom and avoidance of self-defined suffering. The author is Professor John Sheeha, who is a professor of moral theology at Benedictine College in Atkinson, Kansas. He serves on the Bioethics Advisory Committee for the Archdiocese of Kansas City, and is the author of Perfecting Human Actions, St. Thomas Aquinas on Human Participation in Eternal and the Christian Moral Life, the Direction for the Journey to Happiness. Professor Sheeha, thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Father. So when I was going through my presentation this morning, my son told me, this is exactly how we're taught not to do this. And then on top of that, he has informed me multiple times, if I go over time, he's leaving because the football game starts at 12. So keeping all that in mind, this might be rushed. All right, so I'm starting off with this slide here that compares quotes from two different worldviews, you might say. So, you can see that the title, Whose Dignity, Which Freedom, is kind of a reference to McIntyre, right? But on this side, I've got two quotes from John Paul II. And I'm going to just kind of go through a bits of them here. So the dignity of this life is linked not only to its beginning, to the fact it comes from God, but also to its final end. Joseph Rice here talked a little bit about that already, right? And then we kind of go down here, it says, certain ways of acting is radically incompatible with the love of God and with the dignity of the person created in his image. So this is probably the version of dignity most of you are quite familiar with coming from the Catholic tradition, right? But on the opposite side, I have some quotes from other people who view dignity very differently. And in fact, a lot of what goes on in the American legal tradition, I think, is this focus of death with dignity as how it's kind of come in. Their view of dignity is very different. So I'll just look at these really quickly. Death with dignity means being able to take that final choice out of the hands of doctors and putting it squarely in my hands. And of course, what's the concept here? This is being able to choose euthanasia, right? Or in physician-assisted suicide. That's what I was looking at, right? And then down here, this has been alluded to in other talks already from Ruth Macklin. Human dignity is nothing more than a capacity for rational thought and action. And dignity is a useless topic. All right, so what's going on here? You've got two rival worldviews with two rival versions of the person here. So on the, let's see, I think if I press something here, does something come out? No, maybe not. All right. So on the left-hand side here, you get the teleological, this view of humans as being part of an ordered world that God created us, that when we're made ultimately for relationships with other people, we're made ultimately with relationships with God, right? We've got a wise and loving God who creates this world, and God works through humans. So you think like the body of Christ imagery in the New Testament. Christ is working through us, or the vine and branches in John chapter 15. God's working through us here. And we're fulfilled by ultimately participating in God's wisdom and love. The more we share in God's wisdom and love, the more we're in right relationship with Him and other people. And as a consequence, the more fulfilled we are, and the more happy we are. Right? We've got a wise and loving God who made us ultimately to be happy when we do the things that he made us to do. All right, on the opposite side, we got radical individualism, or you can pick your term here, your expressive individualism or expressive personalism, all right, whatever you want to call it here. And the idea is that personhood is centered in the individual as opposed to relationship on the side. And often that individual is solely defined in opposition to others. And what's their view of God in this version? It's a powerful God with absolute freedom to do anything he wants, right? And however, they generally reject this God. After all, why would you accept a God like this? And so he's generally rejected or made ineffectual, either through deism or in the Catholic Church, making him into what I call the teddy bear God, which couldn't possibly expect you to do anything difficult. God's causality, therefore, reduces human causality. You know, if God existed, right, if he told you to do something or caused you to do something or gave you grace, you would be less free. You're doing less. In this particular system, human fulfillment is self-defined, and freedom is a solely a radical autonomy here. All right, so then moving on from this, we get to this view where you can make a distinction between true and false freedom here. Now, this term, true freedom, this is a term John Paul II uses regularly. Sometimes you'll see it as authentic freedom. Sometimes you'll see it as responsible freedom. Benedict XVI also talks about it. So I have it said two different ways here. But where are they getting it from? Well, it's coming out of the document Libertas, which is written by Leo XIII, where Leo XIII talks at length about what's the difference between true freedom and false freedom. Now, where's Leo XIII getting it from? Well, he's pulling it out of Thomas Aquinas. So in Thomas, you have this distinction ultimately between true and false freedom there as well. And so what's the distinction going on here? I'm not going to go through all of these, but so if I didn't use Leo XIII's terminology, true freedom comes when you have a perfection of the intellect, the will, and the emotions, resulting in rational, loving actions ordered towards relationships. Whereas if I was talking about sort of John Paul II terms, I'd say freedom and obedience to the truth, right? Where he always couples freedom to the truth. But they ultimately mean exactly the same thing. When are you most free? You're most free when you know what you're doing, you love properly, and you've got your emotions rectified in line with your intellect and your will. That's when you're most free. That's when you are able to do what you really want, which is, down here, the ability to attain true happiness. That fulfills the innate inclinations imprinted on the human heart. Unlike false freedom on the other side, the more you share in God's wisdom and love, the more you participate in his wisdom and love, the freer you are. This increases your ability to attain what you really want as a human being. And performing free actions results in even greater freedom. Because you're doing loving actions, causing the virtue of charity to increase, the virtues of wisdom to increase in the intellect, virtues of temperance and fortitude. All these virtues are increasing, which makes you even more free to do the things you really want, which is to be truly happy. And in this view, there are degrees of freedom then. So one of these, I guess you'd say, degrees of freedom is this false view of freedom. And I don't want to go through all of this here because I think you understand, flowing through this, this idea of dignity as autonomy, of the person as pure autonomy, what is freedom going to mean? In a sense, arbitrary decisions to do whatever you want, right? And there's some truth in this, but it's certainly only a small amount of the truth when it comes to freedom. And I just want to hit 2 points on this. Obviously, law, virtue, nature. Virtue depends on the person, but law, God, your human nature, all in a sense reduce your freedom. They all take away freedom. And performing false free actions doesn't increase your freedom, but it decreases your freedom. Why? Because instead of forming virtues, you form vices. All right, so moving on here then. So corresponding then to true freedom and false freedom is true happiness and false happiness. I don't necessarily know that I'm going to go through all this slide here, but I think this is actually the easier thing to understand. That you've got that certain that all these different actions people are doing, so, whatever it might be, the person who's seeking happiness in drugs, the person who's seeking happiness in God, the person who's seeking happiness in true relationships, the person who's seeking happiness in degrading others, all these people are ultimately seeking a good, and sometimes these goods are goods that allow you to become even happier in the long term. Relationships, gods, things of that nature. They perfect who you are as an individual. So not only are you happy, you're doing the things God made you to do, so you become even happier in the future. On the opposite end, you've got, false happiness. Those seeking happiness in drugs or degrading other people or things of that nature. And so as the bottom part here says, since there is some good in these ends, false happiness is a happiness. However, these false goods bring short-term happiness, but in the long term cause unhappiness. Or for those that can remain distracted, a very low level of happiness. This is the way that most people in the modern world deal with false happiness, is they just keep distracted. And with technology and social media, it's easy to do. Moving on here then. All right, so then, of course, corresponding to this, we're going to we'll have a notion of true dignity versus false dignity, which corresponds to these two views. And what I did with true dignity is I said, let's look across the entire Catholic tradition on this topic. Let's go back to Thomas. Let's look at John Paul II. Let's look at Benedict. Let's see how they're really using these terms. And I kind of put it together like this, that true dignity acts in the same way as a transcendental acts. And so what's a transcendental? Well, the traditional transcendentals are being, unity, oneness, goodness, truth, and beauty. And they're used different ways by different people in the tradition. And in fact, in the architecture presentation I was just in, they talked about goodness, truth, and beauty. These are the things everybody seeks. Everybody seeks goodness. Not just some goodness, but goodness in every way. Everyone seeks truth. Everyone seeks beauty. Right? And so moving on here. So what's going on here? What is a transcendental in the traditional sense of the term? Well, the being of something is determined ultimately by its degree of participation in God. So this is, Joseph Royce talked about this idea that why are we good? Because God loves us. Well, the more God loves us, the more being something has. You might say the more existence it has. So humans have a greater existence than something like an animal has, which has greater existence than something like a plant, which has greater existence than a material things, because God loves them more. And they're more sophisticated in a sense, in that there's greater truth, and God's knowledge causes them to have a higher end, to have more sophisticated relationships with other people. They're fulfilled in ways that need way more training, you might say. Like, you don't have to train a plant to grow or a spider to spin a web, but you've got to train your kids for many, many years. And even then, it might seem a little difficult. I have 3 of my sons in the audience here, right? And so, right? And so you kind of get this idea. In as much as something has beauty, it is also good. In as much as it's good, it's also true. Did I say beauty there? I meant being. In as much as something has being, it's also good. So the degree of being something has is the degree of goodness something has. The degree of goodness something has is the degree of truth it has. And as many would say, the degree of beauty it has. And what I would like to add to this is the degree of dignity something has. In as much as God loves you, you have dignity. So we'd also say things like plants, animals, things like that have dignity, but it's certainly going to be less than that of a human being. Because after all, what is dignity at the end of the day? It's just simply your worth. And your worth is ultimately dictated by your goodness, which is ultimately dictated by how much God loves you. So let's go back then I do want to say the last part here. So then that brings us to an important part here. Something's being is found not only in a substantial being, in other words, that you're a human being, but also in its proper accidents. In other words, you are not just a human person, right? So you are maybe a wise person or a loving person. And inasmuch as you're wise, where does that wisdom also come from? It comes from God. So that's part of your being as well. So that allows us to look at humans and say, every human has a dignity in as much as they're human. But then we can also add into this idea that certain things are necessary for us to be dignified in the way God created us to be dignified. So we'll come to that point in a little bit here. All right, so let's go back to the slide before. So, in as much as something has being, it has dignity. All existing things have some dignity. I already made that point, didn't I? So this means grace, virtue, gifts, good actions, all these things increase your dignity. And all these are participations ultimately in God. On the other hand, vices impair dignity but do not remove substantial dignity. Right? So if you remember the contentions with McIntyre's presentation, right? It was kind of over this last point, right? And so you can, in a sense, your vice is impaired, or if we wanted to put it in Thomistic terms, we might say something along the lines of this. Your vices corrupt your natural inclination to your true end, but they never remove those natural inclinations. We don't, to put it in a different time frame, we might say we never become totally deprived. Never totally depraved, right? Which is anachronistic for this presentation. But anyway, on the other hand, false dignity is going to be that state of being an autonomous person. So this is that whole death of dignity movement. What do they mean when they talk about dignity? They mean recognizing that you're an autonomous being, right? Dignity comes from being able to freely choose one's concept of happiness. Yeah, hence the terms of dignity and support of physician-assisted suicide. Dignity as a idea that, so if we look at some of the court cases, this idea of dignity is paired with physician-assisted suicide. This idea of dignity is paired with the idea of contraception. Everybody should have the dignity and the right to define their own lifestyles, things that make them happy, things like that. I'm sure some of you guys could quote that much better than me because I'm doing it from memory. And it's been used to support abortion as well. All right, moving on here then. Next point here. Oops, went through that one already. So, true dignity continued then. Because dignity participates in the dignity of God, then, it is always going to be a gift. It's always something given to us, right? That was a point made already here as well. So how does this work into the other transcendentals? So, the fact that you have goodness means I should love you, right? God loved you, therefore you're good. What's my proper response? To love you in return. The fact that your truth is based on God's knowledge of you means I should seek to get to know you, right? This is what relationships are about, isn't it? Knowing and loving other people. The fact that you are made by God in an ordered manner, ordered to a particular end, right? That you're proportionally made in a sense that you're ordered to do your proper actions. You're beautiful. What should my response to that? The love of the order within you, the awe at you as a human being. Right? And we could take this and apply to anything in the created world, right? Obviously in proportion to its degree of being, or dignity, I would like to say here. So what does dignity elicit in another person? So dignity should elicit honor. I don't want to use the term respect because I think that term has been badly damaged in the modern world. So what's honor here? Honor, right, the love of likeness of God and things, is perfected by the virtue of piety, which is a sub-virtue under justice. So to think back, maybe you saw the McIntyre, most of you probably saw the McIntyre presentation. What's his response ultimately about? We should have true justice, which is exactly what Dr. Philpott talked about here, right? And so if somebody has dignity, then what's our response going to be? Ultimately, love of that person, giving them ultimately all those things which are essential for them to attain their proper end. That is what dignity elicits in the particular person. And it also means, of course, that therefore we would recognize there is such a thing as living a life of dignity and, in a sense, living a life not in a dignified manner, right? Where people are not able to perform their actions to enter into the loving relationships they're all made to do. All right, what else do I want to hit up here? Humans have a right to all things necessary to live a life of dignity. That's this whole point in Catholic social thought, and the understanding of dignity as intrinsic value, as a matter of bearing, and as status are all given meaning. So where's this coming from? A lot of the literature on dignity will speak of dignity used in three different ways in the history. And historically, some people looked at dignity as a matter of status. You are a king, therefore you have dignity. You are a professor. Oh, I'm a professor. Therefore, I have dignity, right? Others have looked at dignity as, in a sense, a matter of bearing. What are your virtues? And others have talked about intrinsic value, like, well, most of the Catholic tradition. But the reality of it is, all of these refer to your degree of being. All of these refer to your participation in God, always in a proper way. So if I'm looking at this and asking, so what's your status? Well, I can't always determine what your status is. That's ultimately determined by your relationship with God, isn't it? It's not quite the same thing as if I said, are you a king or whatever? But what is due to people who do great things in your life who can never repay? Well, honor is due to them. That's what the virtue of piety is all about. We have piety to, traditionally, your parents, your country, right? And I always like to add your teachers. But the saints, the angels, all these people who do great things to you that you can never ultimately repay here. And performing evil actions is more against dignity than having evil inflicted upon oneself. So how does this tie over to the realm of bioethics? First one's obvious. So if we go back to the two worlds here, all humans, true dignity, all humans have dignity from conception to natural death. Abortion is a greater violation of the dignity of the mother and all else involved than it is to a violation of the baby. And same with all these other things, right? And there's a lot of the pro-life movements to be changed into talking about, ultimately, anybody who aborts their baby or hurts somebody else, they're failing in their ability to truly be happy and to have proper relationships. Abortion hurts the mom way more than the baby, always. All right, let me wrap this up. Father's telling me I'm out of time. My son wants to go watch football. All right. On the opposite end, okay, over here you see, this understanding of dignity, what it ultimately means. And so how does this apply to dialogue with others? I don't have time to go into this, but I just want to say one thing here, and that is, modern society has a false understanding of freedom, a false understanding of happiness, false understanding of beauty, false understanding of dignity, right? And really for us to fix that is going to take a lot more than you might just say, speaking of dignity as the beginning of respect for others. It's going to be about transforming culture, and that's really the only way to fix the problem. And so, all right, because my son wanted me to have pictures. There we go.
Thank you so much, Professor Sheha. And we have questions. We will take the question for 15 minutes so that Professor Sheha's sons can go watch football afterwards. And to make sure that they only miss the adverts, so the initial part of the football game. So we'll use that microphone. We'll have 15 minutes for question. Please summarize your question or your comments within 30 seconds. Thank you. And if it's a question, let the one you're directing the question to know about it. Just mention the name.
My name or his?
His name.
Okay. Professor Philpott, I have a question for you. And you used the term Eucharistic Justice, and I didn't follow what you meant by that. If you could just explain that again briefly.
Yeah. So my argument was that if you interpret the text of the Bible as I'm proposing, then Paul refers to justice as uses the concept of justice to describe God's saving act through cross and resurrection. So if we see Eucharist as the act of cross and sacrifice and resurrection, right? Then the Eucharist would be justice. So that's in the sense that we can talk about Eucharistic justice. Yeah.
This is for the panel, but prompted by your comments at the end. How do we interact with secular culture if our presumption of dignity is founded in intrinsic value of the individual, whereas secular culture's perception of that is personal choice and autonomy.
Was the question prompted by who, sir? Okay, all right, so, all right. Go ahead, please.
Whoever wants to.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, you can start.
All right, it's fine. I'll start. All right, so this is something after showing all my students just how depressing the world is. That there are no quick fixes, right? So that follows with a couple classes on, so how do we transform the world? How do we change culture? And I'll often give them various different ways. And oftentimes I'll highlight like the phenomenological method of John Paul II or something like that, right? But I think the basic answer to this really is going to have to be, you're going to have to enter into long-term loving relationships which are with people of the secular culture. I think that's the only real answer to it. And that means putting yourself in organizations or starting organizations or being part of groups that go and interact with people that are different from you. And that means you're probably not going to affect lots of people in your lifetime. But it's not just about transforming culture, because transforming culture is very, very important towards, if we really want to make other people treated in a really dignified way and people to be happy. But it does mean that probably everybody you interact with will be much happier than they would have been otherwise. And that's kind of to take several hours of lecture and boil it down. And there just are no easy fixes. But there are ways we can treat this with children also that can be a lot, faster or better, things like that. But I'm gonna let someone else talk.
Did you want to say something?
Maybe something briefly, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, one the challenges you face when you have a Christian conception or theistic conception, and then you're kind of entering into conversation with secular culture is, what kind of language can you use? And so the kind of first instinct that one Catholic might say would be use language of natural law, because that's commonly, shared reason. And we might ground human dignity and moral norms and so forth on natural law. Now, in my presentation, that might seem to be a problem, because I'm wanting to say there's what we can know by reason, but it also involves much that is revealed. The justice that is really, in my view, only really known fully through the revelation, through Christ and so forth. And that might even seem to make the project more burdensome. That if we have to bring in that, and then harder to talk to the secular person. And I acknowledge that's a difficulty. I think in certain ways, though, I would also argue, though, paradoxically, that there are aspects of what is revealed that might actually could make it the vision more attractive. For instance, take something like the issue of abortion. Well, if you say, okay, make the case for the right to life and based upon the personhood of the unborn person and so forth and so on, all of which I certainly accept. Okay, that's a good argument, and I think it's better than the other arguments. But I think also if you add to that, though, virtues like care and healing and forgiveness and so forth, I think it could actually make the ethic more attractive, particularly to a person who is, in the experience of this very difficult situation. And, there's still the issue of, if you're, the kind of bridging the discourses, but, in some ways also there are ways that one can flesh out, theological concepts in ways that are sort of shared phenomenon that can relate to people, or flesh out some of the virtues that come from that and practices that come from that in ways that might actually make it more attractive.
Thanks. I would say restore the family and fight for that because everything passes through the family. The second thing would be to pray, and especially to pray for people in mortal sin, which St. Teresa of Jesus said was the greatest almsgiving you can do, because there's a certain community of thought that comes from being in the state of grace. And when people aren't you can't judge who's in the state of grace, but what you can pray for everybody, including praying for me, please, is you can pray that I be in the state of grace, so that I can think more clearly. Because what happens when you're separated from God is you're turning away from the truth in some aspect. The third thing I would say is that falsehood is some type of a deformation of truth. Logically, it's a positive deformation of the truth. And so when we're dialoguing with people who are accepting something false, well, the first thing is that they may see something that we don't see. So let's not immediately say that we have all the truth and they don't. But the key is to find the kernel of truth. There is no such thing as a pure falsehood. So if somebody is saying something that we don't think is true, find out what they're saying in that sentence that is true, and then work from there. Because there's, I have a great hope for all of this if we get back to the basics, restore the family and form consciences, and be generous in seeking the truth with other people. The rest of it comes down to intellectual arguments. We can talk about which arguments work, et cetera, but I don't think that comes in until you put in the basics.
Thank you.
Professor Philpott, your distinction or your recapitulation of what you think is the Christian or the biblical understanding of justice seems to be most at odds with the sort of Roman or whatever civic liberal tradition when it comes to the violation of justice. So that is, what do you do with the people who are, it's easy to say, how do you fix some justice on the side for those who have been violated maybe, but what do you do with the violators? And you brought up this with restorative justice. Would you speak more about that?
Yes, I can. Yeah, the question was with respect, what does the biblical justice mean with respect to violators? And so again, I think the due conception would focus on retribution, that kind of the wrong deed and guilt deserves punishment. Punishment, wrongs have consequences and so forth. And I think that core idea is right. We shouldn't throw it out or say replace it with a utilitarian notion or what have you. But I think that the biblical notion of restoration of right relationship actually implies a much wider and fuller way to respond. And I think we see this played out in society in what we call restorative justice. So imagine someone who does a wrong, instead of just receiving the prison sentence, you get so many years, and then you've done what is due, then you're out. That you look at the whole range of harms that the wrong has done to persons and relationships, and so including the importance of restoring the one who the one who has committed the crime. And I once was involved in a restorative justice case where a kid had vandalized a store. Now you could just put him in jail and so forth and say that that's justice. The scales have been balanced. But instead, in a restorative justice forum, you brought together the store owner, the parents, the basketball coach, and so forth, and the kid had to hear about the damage that was done from the store owner, and then he also spoke about what led him to the crime and so forth. But then the solution then they came up with is the kid would work in the store, the equivalent amount of time to restore, the damage that had been done, right? And so then he would learn virtues and hard work in the process, and the store owner would recover his property, and looking at it in terms of the fabric of relationships rather than simply the narrower idea of desert, even though I would not want to throw that out either.
Professor Rice, I'd like to applaud something that you said. I taught at this university for almost 40 years, and primarily two courses, amongst others. One was called Evil in the Lie, Modern European Literature. and the other one was self-definition and the quest for happiness. And my students at the end of such a course would always ask me, how can we live decent lives? And I know they expect me to come up with some academic thing or other. And I would tell them, have a happy family. That's exactly what you said. That is the best gift to the world. Have a happy family. So I can only applaud what you said.
All right. Sir.
Just to join with that, just to echo how wonderful that observation is, but also just to tie in those wonderful contributions that it's relationships that make us happy, you know, and that's what the family teaches us, and that's what we have to convey, that our happiness is found in right. It's not just that justice is found in right relationship, but our personal happiness is found in right relationship. Primarily through the family. So I just want to thank the three of you. I thought those three presentations were magnificent, and I really appreciate being here.
That seems to be the best way to come to a close, right? So on behalf of the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, I want to thank the three panelists, Professor Shihab, Professor Rice, and Professor Philpott, for your time, insights. And also I want to thank all of you for listening, and also for your contribution, and also for your questions. Thank you. God bless you. Have a good day.